Hi, and welcome to my sci-fi, fantasy, and horror short fiction roundup for September 2020. And this month I've got, well, first of all, I'm a bit late. My apologies. But I'm sharing 13 excellent stories that I read in September. And if you want even more short fiction to read, I recommend you check out my short fiction treasures roundup at Strange Horizons because it has a bunch of other stories and some novellas as well. Anyway, so let's jump into it. My first story pick this month is We Will Build a Haunted House by Andrew Van Wey in Lamplight magazine. Now, this is a decidedly haunting and deeply unsettling story where the jagged edge of cruelty, misfortune, and horror cuts ever deeper as we follow the origins of a haunted house. We learn about its beginnings and how it grows, how it ensnares the wicked and unwary and the willing, how it terrifies visitors and pulls children and adults deep into itself until they cannot escape. History wraps itself around the horror, and there's such a wrenching sense of wounded rage and menace and sorrowful malevolence here. I read this story very late one night, and it followed me into my dreams, and I think that's a really great horror story when it can do that, when it haunts you after you read it. My next pick is Call Them Children by Wenmi Mareba Kloba Collins in the Dark. In a world where the water and the mangrove trees are everywhere, the looming threat of Mamadlo means that children are disappearing. And the adults don't seem to know what to do. Braving all the dangers lurking above and below the surface, Yuya heads out into the water to look for Camellia, who is missing. But as it turns out, the real danger is what awaits Yuya when Camellia is found. A taut, atmospheric horror story that spirals deeper and deeper into terror the further we follow Yuya. Beautifully written, deeply weird, and thoroughly wonderful. My next pick is More Than Simple Steel by M.A. Ogden in Escape Pod, narrated by Peter Baravesh. This is a post-apocalyptic tale where only children seem to be left in the world and where a 16-year-old boy is trying to build a community and care for a group of kids. This responsibility is a very heavy burden that's weighing him down and wearing him down. And then a girl arrives with a gun, and everything that was already paper thin and brittle seems about to unravel. Ogden masterfully makes you feel the tension, love, and strife within this community of children. The characters, and especially the relationships between them, are perfectly captured. Fraught, tense, taut, and yet full of hope and empathy. For me, it's this depth that sets this story apart. If you're looking for a post-apocalyptic tale that might be bleak, but not devoid of hope, then this is it. My next pick is Prism by S.D. Brown in Augur magazine. It's a story about a woman who loses her child while she's in prison, and it's one of the most unsettling, evocative, and memorable stories I've read this year. Weaving in and out of the past, the present, and the future, it dips into horror and darkest fantasy. What makes it so devastating is how real it all feels. There's a childhood marked by death and trauma, by being an outsider, and being blighted by a mother who seems beyond reach even when she's right there with her knitting. Brown skillfully blends the everyday world with strands of mind-bending strangeness, and yet it's a strangeness that is firmly rooted and knit into, quite literally, the fabric of reality. My next story pick is Silver as the Devil's Necklace by Isabel Cañas in Pseudopod and narrated by Sandra Espinosa. Ruth's sister Jo is missing. Jo's gone looking for a black horse she saw, a strange black horse that might or might not have been something other than a horse. And now Ruth, who said she didn't believe Jo, didn't believe in that black horse, heads out into the dark and stormy night to find her sister. I love the rich, sumptuous prose of the story, and I love the fierce desperation and urgency of Ruth's quest. I also love the way different gods and beings meet here, and how Ruth is assailed and maybe also helped by forces she didn't quite believe in before. My next story pick is Phantasmagoria by Abby Hines in Black Static. Hines' story is a quiet and unsettling and deeply relatable story about adolescence, identity, and about trying to find a place in the world where you might fit in, body and soul. Hines' story delves deep into the awkwardness of trying to figure out who you are and who you might become, while also exploring the shame and the joy, the lust and the fear of being human, and what we might lose along the way as we grow up. There's a dark thread running through this story that made me think about all the possible lives and the possible selves we might have had, might have become, might have explored, and how these other selves and other lives might haunt us for the rest of our days. Next up is The Banquet by Lindy Biller in Apparition Literary Magazine. It was the winner of the September Flash Fiction Challenge. Old school fairy tale vibes twined together with the reality of domestic abuse and violence in a gripping, gritty story by Lindy Biller. There's a father who won't let his daughter leave, a mother who seems resigned to her fate of serving the man in her life, and a daughter who is determined to escape the confines of the home where she's grown up. And I love the way this story rings with the sound and sights of fairy tale, yet keeps a real-world edge. Next up is Dragon Years by Juliet Kemp in The Future Fire. This is a very warm and moving story about a girl who sees a dragon, first when she's a little girl, and then several more times in her life. While she is tempted, she chooses not to follow when the dragon asks her to come, at least the first few times. There's a deep sense of mingled joy and sadness and regret here that is absolutely wonderful, and the ending just about cracked my heart. If you enjoy the story by Kemp, you should also read Small Magics in Flash Fiction Online. It's also part of my short fiction treasures roundup for Strange Horizons. My next story pick is Deep in the Drift, Spinning by Lisa L. Hannett in Beneath Ceaseless Skies. And I'm going to start with a quote from the story. With the mental inhalation, Winnie sifts the drift for the right whirl in the air, the right future Gert's here to imbibe. She draws everything in, these avian vessels, their airborne calls, their salt spray scent. Magic, not marrow, will soon fill the gull's delicate bones. Magic to set them all flying. End quote. I love Lisa L. Hannett's fiction, and her stories are often a blend of weirdness and darkness and magic, and this story is an excellent example of her wondrous prose and her strange and often harrowing fantasy worlds. Winnie in the story uses the bodies of birds to make and harvest magic. She can change things, she can change people, she can see what might happen. And yet, in spite of that power, she has not been able to get back her daughter. lost to Winnie and headed out on paths of her own. Winnie's world is a hard-scrabble place, full of hard lives, tough choices, and the choice Winnie ultimately makes here, what she has to sacrifice to get what she wants, makes for a sharp piece of fiction. My next story is Note to Self by Sunny Moraine in Lightspeed. And I'm going to start with a quote from the story. The notion of the quantum mirror was first floated by two graduate students, Sapna Gupta and Mark Shaw, over a fourth round of beers in a small pub in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and therefore one should consider the role of intoxication in its initial conception. End quote. This story is written as an unfinished essay, a work in progress with notes from the author to the reader and conversational asides to themselves. And it feels a bit like Umberto Eco's writing, riffling through found notes, blending real-world literature and events with science fiction. Moraine's intriguing story twines together sci-fi and horror as we found out what happened once the first quantum mirror was made and the world was irrevocably changed. Chilling and gripping. My next story pick is Baboon Brain Brick by Louis Evans in The New Modality. And I'm going to start with a quote from the story. Nothing about Aaron Metzger's mind was out of place except for one comprehensive and overwhelming delusion that the 40 years from 1978 to 2018 had gone remarkably well. Incredibly well. Those 4 decades represented a golden age of global peace and prosperity that the doctors could scarcely imagine. End quote. Oh, this is the story I needed to read in these dark times. It's a story that makes you think that maybe the world could be a better place. Maybe it could have been a lot better already if only people had been able and willing to make other choices. And maybe in an alternate timeline, we are all doing quite all right. Wouldn't that be nice? In Evans' story, Aaron Metzger drops into our world with memories of quite a different world lodged in his mind. When he is told of the current reality, he is at first depressed and confounded. I can relate. But then he uses his alternate timeline knowledge to nudge our world in a better direction, except, well, you'll have to read it to find out what happens. It's a clever, darkly humorous, and heartfelt story that made me long for better days. My next story pick is The Star Flighter from Starim by Tamoha Sengupta and Suscape. A delightful and heartwarming, and I mean this in the best, truest sense of the word, fable of whales in space and the secrets they carry with them, and how one of them ends up alone in Earth's oceans. Eventually, it ends up sparking tales of wonder among those who see it ascend. And my last story pick for this month is Redder by Vaira Chandrasekhara in Nightmare. And I'm starting with a quote from this story. I chew the leaf and spit out my red days. They splatter. You chew the leaf and spit out your hours of mad redder. They splatter. They chew the leaf and spit out the reddest moments they have ever seen. They splatter. This is a scene of crime. Chalk me, mourn me, eve me. My red life drying on my chin. Your red history, a bitter powder crust. Their thin red lines, their spun red webs, their red praxis and deceit. Compelling, end quote. Compelling, mesmerizing, full of terror and wonder, this story is visceral. To quote Chandrasekhara on Twitter, it features crocodiles, political assassination, and the tallest of grandmother's tales. It's also part of a set of stories, and again, quoting the writer's Twitter thread, Redder was written as part of a thematic triptych of sorts, the second of which, titled Red Starts in the Last Summer, will appear in next year's Chiral Mad anthology. And I can only tell you to read this story in Nightmare. It's the kind of story I hesitate to even attempt to describe because so much of it is woven into the language, but I will say it's brilliant. And those were my story picks for this month. Thanks so much for listening, and if you want to read this roundup, it's available at curiousfictions.com. And thanks so much for listening, and I'll have another roundup for you next month.